Is the sound all right? Okay. No? This darn thing.
Which I believe we will all share. It is that the general elections may hasten the day when there will be employment for all, when labor may be duly honored and receive its due reward.
At any cost? At any cost? How far would you go with that? How far would you extend that?
Just watch me.
You've got Rasminsky at the Bank of Canada saying the country is going to pieces practically every year for the last 5 or 6 years.
And Turner, just one second.
Once any
You
nation,
do not have a monopoly on patriotism. And I resent the fact that your implication that only you are a Canadian.
Hello and welcome to the fourth episode of the podcast of the Red Ensign. I am here again with my co-host Kryptos. Kryptos, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, thank you. Yeah, it's been it's my busy season, and but it's still nice to be able to find some time to do some writing and get together to chat with you about Canadian politics.
Well, speaking of doing some writing, today is a very sad episode. We're in mourning because Kryptos has now written a piece more popular than my last three pieces put together for the Red Ensign Substack. So you can all go there and you can add to my ratio if you like. His piece is on the Carney moment in Canadian politics. There's more to it than that. But do you want to kind of give a thumbnail sketch of what you were writing about?
Sure. And for people to know, like, this is the funny thing about internet discourse is that I forget even who brought us together. Maybe it was Stephen Carson. But we both started, we kind of bumped into each other, came together on the internet when we were fairly tiny accounts and have grown together and have had this wonderful little sort of friendly rivalry over the last while, where oftentimes, because we're trying to shape discourse, we're posting on the same topics, the same themes. And we will kind of go back and forth as to whose tweets are doing better, which surprisingly enough, you often seem to beat me fairly regularly on that.
Oh,
regard.
on Twitter, so, I'm much better at Twitter as a medium than you are. It's not that close. You get more followers, but I'm better at that medium.
I like that. It's not that close. There we go. That's good. See, this is how friendly rivalries happen. So yeah, it goes back for. But as he mentioned, even though we started about. There was a brief period where he had about 500 followers more than I did. And since then, the gap has been as wide as 2,000, although you've narrowed it to about 1,000 now, because I have just been busy and not been tweeting a whole lot. And the discourse has just been boring and dull anyways, until we started this project, which has made everything fun again. So there we go.
Yeah, well, but let's talk about the piece for a second.
Yeah, so
we're looking into a federal election in Canada. That's a logical time to review the evolution of politics in the country. And I think that's really, like, the piece is trying to take stock of that moment. And there's a couple of kind of interesting themes that come out of it.
Yeah, it's one of these things where I think for a lot of us, because we're inundated with American media in Canada, we tend to look at Canadian politics through the lens of American politics, which is, there's a term that I picked up in university that I think is helpful. Canadian politics is what's called an in toto. In other words, the politics are kind of built and projected around the center out of the totality. So the existing power structures tend to dictate the nature of political thinking. Whereas in the US, there does tend to be a lot of, even though power is still power and it still works the way it normally works, the surface layer of American politics is this populism, where ideas build out from the fringes towards the center. So what's called an ex parte system. And so we generally tend to take that model and project it onto Canadian politics. And so there is a portion of politics that, in a sense, tries to emulate that, and which is really the group that is the power interests that sort of coalesce around the Albertans, resource extraction, oil, and so forth. Now, from an institutional perspective,
a great example of this is the People's Party of Canada, right?
Exactly.
Who thought they could bring ideological politics to Canada. And I mean, they had a brief moment during COVID where it looked like they might actually be able to, because the consensus around COVID was so insane that you just there was a political opportunity there that was just historically large. But in general, it has been. I mean, if you look at what the PPC is projected to do this time, what the Green Party has been able to do, there's very little evidence that you can actually, that's the right way to attack Canadian politics from an ideological perspective. It's very, very well insulated against that kind of attack.
Well, and since we are going to talk about George Grant, this is something that Grant talked about in terms of prairie politics, what he called, prairie populism. And so we have identified sort of the piece. In the piece, I do this as well to identify three major constituent groups in Canada that have like real, what we call in toto, institutional power in that sense, where there's a real proper power base behind their surface presence. And that would be, the one would be the French Quebecois, so ethno-nationalism, and they don't really worry about projecting onto Canada. They just want to secure their turf in Quebec. Then you have the two parties that generally battle over the whole of Canada are the Laurentians, so the English-speaking people in Ontario and English Montreal, and their power bases in industry, banking, law, and the government, and civic institutions. Then you have this Western power base in the Albertans, and that is focused around resource extraction, oil, lumber, various mining minerals, and so forth. Now, the Albertans always feel aggrieved because resource extraction is very valuable for Canada. It makes lots of money and it pays for everything. And so Albertans feel like, hey, you're taking all of our resources out of the ground, and it's money that's coming out of the West into Ontario, Quebec, the Maritimes, and so forth. So we're doing all of this providing, and we're getting nothing back for it. So they feel a sense of resentment, right? And so they have their power base in the West, but the thing is, this power base does not match the Laurentian ability to exercise institutional control over the country through industry, banking, the government, and so forth. And so the Conservatives have generally, and this is something that Grant noted, have tried to turn to populism to overcome their lack of institutional control. And so
I also think we need to have a historical pause here, because at the time Grant was writing, Canada was a substantially different country than it is today. So at the time Grant was writing, the forces behind the Conservative Party, sure, there was Western Canada and a proto-elite out there, but you were also talking about rural Ontario as a really important player in that coalition at the time.
Yes.
Whereas today, if you were to look at that coalition, there's a whole set of institutions that have grown up around the Western elite. They have their sense-making apparatus inside a whole group of think tanks. So you can have a guy like Stephen Harper, not in official politics, but the de facto political leader of the Western elite for a whole period before he became leader of the Conservative Party of Canada.
Yes.
So like he goes from the Reform Party into exile in one of these think tank institutions, and then he comes back, and immediately upon coming back, he's got enough institutional backing, and he's been able to have his voice in Western newspapers for the whole time of his exile, so that he can just immediately seize power on his return to formal politics. None of that existed when Grant was writing his book.
No.
The Diefenbaker wave that Grant is writing about looks a lot more like Trump 1.0, where
it does. Yes. Yeah.
You have almost 100% institutional control at that point in the country's history by a Laurentian elite that are directly opposed to Grant. And they execute, from a historical point of view, a classic strategy against a populist, which is wait him out. Create a drip in the media against him and wait him out. incidentally, this is exactly the strategy that's being employed by Team Blue against Trump today. What are
It's
all
probably
those?
going to work too.
What are all those court rulings against him about? Well, they're about
Yeah.
making everything slow down and waiting out the moment of Trump's political power, knowing that populist political power is very fleeting, and if there's suffering along the road, it dries up very, very quickly.
Yeah, this is the thing that people are starting to observe with the tariffs, that, will Trump support evaporate when the initial pinch of tariffs comes along? But that's not really what we're here to discuss. But yeah,
this is not a show about American politics. This is a show about Canadian politics.
But the point stands in regards to Diefenbaker, and to somewhat of an extent for Poilievre, that he still does not have the kind of institutional oomph behind him that he needs then to be embracing a populist. And this is how he's got himself into
one of
trouble.
The other issues is so there's this window in the early 2000s where there's quite a bit of institutional power behind the Western elite. They have a substantial media presence, but whatever you want to say about Trudeau the Younger, the effort that he went to lock down the Canadian media on behalf of the Laurentian elite was profoundly effective. The whole strategy,
subsidies, the
whole journalism subsidy strategy was absolutely brilliant. Just from it's pure evil, but it's also absolutely brilliant.
And maybe explain it to people who haven't heard it. What they actually do.
So in Canada, we have two layer. Well, historically, we had a state media layer and a non-state media layer. And so we had the CBC, Radio Canada, direct funding from the state. Those institutions were always fortresses, the Laurentian elite. But we also had a very large, for a time, non-state media layer, institutions ranging from the Toronto Star to the Globe and Mail to the National Post, all of which were battlegrounds in which competing elites could get their ideas across, for better or for worse. And the entire Western Canadian think tank apparatus was built around this mechanism of public comms. They could write a piece. Stephen Harper could write a piece for a think tank. He could have it posted in the Calgary Herald. He could get the Globe and Mail to talk about it. He could get the National Post to talk about it, and he could speak to the Canadian people through this propaganda apparatus that existed. During COVID, under the guise of combating misinformation and under the guise of bailing out the Canadian media from their poor financial prospects as print media is dried up and as they really struggle to compete in the kind of paid subscription world, the Trudeau government did a number of things. First of all, they killed Facebook News in the country because it wasn't carrying enough Canadian content, was carrying too much, quote, disinformation. Second, they put Google in a position where in order to operate in Canada, they had to privilege Google, YouTube had to privilege mainstream media in Canada, and mainstream media as defined by the CRTC. So now if you go and search for the Canadian truck convoy protest, instead of getting all the organic reports on the ground, which you were getting at the time in 2020, you will get page after page after page of CBC or Globe and Mail or CTV or whatever other mainstream outlet had reporters talking about it. Right, you'll have to go to page like 300 to find somebody who was actually there and who actually took a video of it, because of the Canadian content rules that were enforced upon Google. And then the third leg of this plank of this plan was to take accredited institutions and not only indirectly subsidize them by threatening all the platform companies to carry them, but also directly subsidize them by picking up a fraction of the salary of every reporter on their payroll. So if you're a qualifying media organization, around which there are very obviously editorial guidelines based on the ones that qualify and the ones who don't, you get a 35% subsidy for the salary of all your reporters. Through this mechanism, the Laurentian Elite have assured for themselves, through the mechanism of the CRTC, total editorial control of the propaganda apparatus in the country. A way more complete system than existed maybe at any time since the Second World War.
We're subjected to it, and we have to learn to sort of keep our own thoughts and ignore it to some extent, and navigate our way through it to find, pick our way through it to find, to try to figure out like what's really going on. But when you step back and have a look at it, this is something I was talking on a Semyagog's podcast last night. People think, well, are the Laurentians really capable of making this pivot? And I said, like, who are you kidding? I said, like, these are the same people that locked us down for 3 years, debanked all the truckers.
Not only debanked them, everybody talked about how cowardly and non-kinetic they are. But when it came down to it, they were happy to have soldiers and police officers come through the streets of Ottawa and arrest people without charge and beat the hell out of them. Like,
trample
anybody who's got
wheelchairs with horses.
Yeah, anybody who's got any delusions about these people being soft and incapable of holding power hasn't been paying attention very well. They're not afraid to send pastors to prison for 40 days in solitary for holding church. Like, these are people who are not afraid to be cruel.
They have effectively given permission for left-wing activist groups to burn churches at their discretion.
Yes,
and nothing is, and to a certain extent, that I think that I'm not sure the exact words, but basically it's like they had it coming.
Yeah, to quote Mr. Trudeau, it's understandable.
That's the word. It's understandable.
It's understandable.
You're just standing back as a Christian. You're going like, oh, so this is where we're at now.
Yeah. So there's a lot of that is very emotional for us because we've been on the wrong side of it at various points. But just looking at it objectively, the idea that somehow pivoting away from migration is beyond these people, if it's in their political interests, is just stupid.
Yeah, and this was something that Jean-Francois noted yesterday. Like, they are completely without soul. They're bloodless. They have the only interest they have is the preservation of the Laurentian Elite, and people have to, when you're looking at Canadian politics, you have to understand you can talk leftism and globalism, and many of these things are baked in structurally, and we'll get to this in the next segment. But at its heart, these folks, they're not concerned ideologically. They may have things that they profess to believe because this is what everyone in elite circles around the globe professes. But in reality, their real concern is maintaining their own particular power structure. And this is the thing for the Laurentians. The Laurentians exist for the Laurentians, and Canada, as it's currently constituted, is good for the Laurentians. So
yes,
the Laurentians are for Canada because Canada is good for them. Not because it works out, not because it makes Canada great for the rest of Canadians, but because Canada, as it's currently constituted, is good for them. So this is kind of then where the piece goes in, is that...
Well, yeah, so we've got a bunch of pieces here. So between the time when we last podcasted and now, I put out a piece on the channel noting Justin Trudeau, the immigration restrictionist, laying out this U-turn on migration, which is it's a piece making a case, not a piece drawing a conclusion. Then we put down this then you put down this article, and the article really makes two two basic points. First, that there are two large migrant groups in Canada that have become their own castles of political power.
Yes.
The Khalistani Sikhs and the CCP-linked Chinese migrants. And at this point, it is undeniable and undeniably noted by the Laurentian elite that these groups exist, that they're independent castles seeking power. And what we're watching, and we're not sure whether this is going to come together quite yet or whether this is down the road, is that the immediate result of becoming a threat to Laurentian elite power is that you become a target of the Laurentian and elite's vengeance.
That's right. Well, and this is the thing, is that there was various layers for why mass immigration was done. There was the politics of value. We're going to help the world deal with the refugee crisis, so Canada's going to be the welcoming, loving country. There's the whole, keeping labor costs down and maintaining population growth. Then there's the whole layer of that once you get into it and you're beginning to fuel like housing prices and increases, you can't stop, because to stop would be to burst the bubble. And then there's the ideal, maybe not, but a politically savvy thing is, hey, if we bring in all these immigrant groups, we can create a loyal client group that will keep us in power forever. And then the other thing is that if we actually manage to create this multicultural country, this will help in our battle with the French Canadians, and it will undermine their position in Canada, because no longer will Canada be a bi-national nation of English and French, but it will be this multicultural hodgepodge of everyone coming together to be Canadian. So by golly, you recalcitrant Frenchmen, you need to get on board and get with the program. And that's basically so that's kind of like the broad reasons that you often see stated. But now all of a sudden what happens is these groups are now here in such numbers that,
well, one of the
given
other
their like,
if the Laurentian elite had their way, they would have wanted diverse and meritocratic immigration, right? They would have wanted immigration not from a couple of countries, but from like 150 countries, right? So that you would produce a migrant population that were their clients, but had no social structure of their own.
Well, and we're also among those who are like the deracinated elites, who are like what Stephen Harper calls the anywheres.
Yeah, exactly.
So these are people that have no real attachment to their own country. They're technocrats. Well, why not make them technocrats here in Canada? And that was how it kind of started.
That's how it started, but that's not how it finished. And I think the moment that you have this transition from a tool which can be effectively wielded by the Laurentian elite for their own purposes to potential rival castles for power, suddenly immigration is quite a different thing. And it will be very interesting to see how this plays out. We're still in the very early stages of this realization and the inevitable forthcoming confrontation. Now,
but I do think that once the Laurentians realize what they have to do, that they're going to have to, in some sense, discriminate against Chinese and Indians, that they'll make it happen. But like I said in yesterday's podcast, it'll be kind of like the movie The Office or Office Space, where you have this figure Milton, who was technically let go, during layoffs, but the accounting department never stopped paying him. And so he just stuck around and got his paycheck, even though he wasn't an employee anymore. And he did filing and other stuff, but he was just there. And so the consultants come in and notice he's not an employee, but you keep paying him. And we realized this was a glitch. And then so somebody asked, well, did you fire them? Like, no, we just fixed the glitch. And so I have we
figure the situation will work itself out naturally.
and so I think that the Laurentian approach will not be direct attack of the Chinese and the Indian groups, but they will do it in such a way as to kind of fix the glitch and just, well, you're not getting paid anymore, so you guys figure out what you need to do. And that will be, I think, kind of, there'll be a lot of bleeding and moaning, and there might be some public hand-wringing from the Laurentians, but nothing will change because they don't care, because it threatens their power, so they will do what they can to destabilize it and to undermine it.
And this is what you've already started to see with the termination, or the making it impossible for 5 million student visas and temporary foreign worker visas to be renewed. So you had 5 million people in this country who thought that they were on the path to citizenship. Probably mostly thought they were on the path to citizenship, all of whom are now on the path towards returning to their home country.
Or at least on the path to landed immigrant status. Many don't necessarily want to even become citizens. They just want to be landed immigrants because that'll allow them to work and buy houses and stuff as if they were Canadians.
Yeah. Whereas now they are definitively not on that path. And no. I think probably irreversibly not on that path, unless Mr. Polyev wins the election, in which case, who knows what will happen. But
and this is the weaker hand that he has, in a sense, because he has been pandering to both the Chinese and the Indian groups to build a populist movement for his resource extraction, lower taxes, economic renewal type of program, that he's really caught between a rock and a hard place, because the only way that he can really differentiate himself from the Laurentians is to make a hard right-wing turn anti-immigrant. And that's like part of the dynamic is that most of the older Canadians are very much bought into the older liberal mindset of being pro-immigrant, all of these left-wing politics that have, the Trudeau years. But increasingly younger Canadians are very, very fed up with mass immigration. They're fed up with the fact that it's hard to get jobs. They're fed up with having to compete with immigrants for jobs that even like their older brothers and sisters used to get, these types of things. And so they want to see some action done. So as you go down the age group, younger voters in age segments, so from 18 to say 35, are increasingly more conservative the younger you get. And this is one of these realities, I think. But
that the liberals... Again, we got to be careful here, because younger voters in Canada are ideologically conservative. They're not attached to the patronage network of the Western elite.
That's right. No, right? That's exactly. Yeah, they're much more when they're young, they're populist. They're not actually tied anywhere. That's correct.
And so they're not married to the Conservative Party hasn't done anything to win their loyalty. There's no, they're not very useful for Mr. Polyev. In fact, they're kind of a problem, because his benefactors in the Western elite are actually probably more pro-migration than the Laurentians are.
At this point, they are, yeah.
So it's a big problem for him in this campaign, and will probably be an enduring problem for the Conservative Party of Canada going forward.
And here's the wild thing from because dispositionally, this is the hard thing to explain to people. In spite of all of sort of the gloss of leftist politics and statist politics, dispositionally, Canadians are very conservative in a sense that they're change averse, right? So they like things to be stable. They like things to stay the same. There's an opportunity for the Liberal Party of Canada and the Laurentians to actually be functionally more conservative than the Conservatives, which is, I think, for somebody south of the border, just kind of is kind of mind-boggling. But once you understand Canadian politics, it makes perfect sense. Yeah.
So anyways, we've kind of talked around this piece. We've also talked about this extensively in some of the outside appearances you and I have made.
Yeah.
You mentioned you were on with Semigog and some other guys talking about explaining Canada to Americans, which is
it was fun.
It's a perpetual duty of people in Canadian politics to explain Canada to Americans. I was recently on with Johan Kurtz discussing the Laurentian elite, their institutions, their mechanisms of power. I think he's actually going to release that on Monday, so probably after this podcast comes out. So there's been a bunch that's gone on since we last met. But when we last met, we were talking about George Grant and Lament for a Nation. For those of you who didn't catch the last podcast, Lament for a Nation is the most famous work by George Grant, who is a Canadian political philosopher who was writing in, I think, the early 70s. Is when Lament for a Nation was released. You can find it on Skeptical Waves helpful channel, where you can archive.org has a complete copy as well if you're a full text enjoyer. If you want to find either of those two things, you can find it via the Red Ensign Substack. There's an article to prep for this. And then Red Ensign podcast number 3, we discussed the historical part of Grant's work. So Grant laid out the failure of the Diefenbaker populist revolt against the Laurentian Elite in the 50s. And he means failure from the point of view of failure to redirect the country, not failure to achieve electoral results. So like many other populists, Diefenbaker was able to achieve a great deal of electoral success, but was unable to translate that electoral success into a durable political coalition or into transformative change in the nation. In our last podcast on Lament for a Nation, we discussed the historical circumstances that led to that series of events. In this podcast, we're going to discuss so Grant is not just a historian, he's also a political philosopher. And in Lament for a Nation, he is lamenting the failure of a particular vision for Canada's future. That particular vision we talked briefly about in our previous podcast, but it is essentially an integralist state, a state where where the key elites that dictate the future of the country are actually inside the government. In this particular version of that integralist state, those elites would be elements of the civil service rather than elements of either the business community or the church or some other alternative grouping. Significantly, we're not talking about like a military-led state. We're talking about a civil service-led state. The kinds of historical analogs for this kind of state, Grant references Gaullist France, which is very precisely what he means, but there are a number of other relatively comparable integralist states that have existed. Late 19th century, early 20th century Prussia is a good example of a successful integralist state, though the military had a more dominant role there than it would have in Grant's imagined future of Canada, I suppose. There's a few others of these. Some of the iterations of the Spanish state were a bit like this. Again, a little bit different because the Catholic Church had an expanded role in that kind of vision. But
even England around the Revolutionary period was fairly similar in many ways to what Grant is envisioning.
Yeah, post-war England is actually a good example of this, where during the Second World War, huge elements of what were previously business interests in England had been nationalized. And so you ended up with an elite, which was the dominant group of the elite was actually inside the British state, and the part of the elite in private, like the commercial part of the elite, was actually subdominant at the time. So there's quite a bit of precedence for it at the time Grant was writing, and it's sort of, what do we think of this as a proposition? I mean, spoiler, I think this is a very flawed vision for Canada, both at the time and in general. But what are your thoughts here?
Well, yeah, okay. So part of this function is examining it, sort of in almost kind of like the history of technology in this regard, that the function of the Gaulish state, even the Prussian state, certain portions of periods in England, there's two sort of aspects. One is that you're subordinating capital and business to the state, but the other is that the state has not yet reached a level of scale that it necessitates a transformation to a different form of administration. So basically, the kind of state that Grant is envisioning is one where power is very much vested in people, an elite class who have the good of the nation in their heart. And this elite class dedicates itself to administering the country, restraining business, directing it on behalf of the nation. So you have an elite class who is, this is something that would be very familiar to people who have read certain works of Carl Schmitt, as he lays out, what is a legitimate in legality and legitimacy, lays out the criteria for a legitimate elite, and almost everything that Grant has in mind, Schmitt checks off on that. And so there's this idea that you have these high functioning people, they're elites, they're in command, and they are basically given the task of running the country, and they administer things. And you think to yourself, well, isn't that just like every bureaucracy? Well, no, there's a difference. The way things are done in this kind of situation is wrapped up in who these people are. And so these people kind of do things the way they want. And if there's a change in person, sometimes they come up from beneath. And
one of the fundamental differences here is
it's cultural.
In this hypothetical world, if there's a change in person, there's a change in policy. Whereas in the actual administrative state we have, if there's a change in person, the new person is compelled to conform to the policy, not the policy compelled to conform to the new person.
And the other thing that is different in this too is that when mistakes happen, people are held accountable for them. Right? So people lose their jobs, they're disgraced. Now, they may not be impoverished or lose their head or anything, but basically their careers are done in the public. They got to find work elsewhere because they're in a sense disgraced because they failed. So it places a high amount of pressure on people to succeed, to do their jobs with integrity, and they build culture within the organizations, within the administration. And sometimes people come up from within the administration, they learn the culture, in which case it kind of carries on, or they come from outside and then they remake the administration after their own image and they redo it. And sometimes that's why you bring somebody in new, because you want to remake the whole bureaucracy, of that segment of the bureaucracy again. So it's very person-centered. But the problem with this type of administration is that it's limited in scale and it's limited over time. You noted already, like the first flaw is what happens in a transition of power between person and person. Well, the whole thing has to be rebuilt from scratch. From an efficiency perspective, that's terrible. So as business begins to expand and take over in society, you want things to be efficient. You want them to be consistent. So you want to create consistent outcomes. You want to create things, make things as efficient as possible. And the way that you do that is by placing technical administrative systems in place. And so you develop policy manuals, you develop procedural manuals, you develop org charts, you develop quality control procedures, so there's all of these controls, these policies, procedures built in. And what happens over time is that the people who staff the organization in many ways become irrelevant to its ongoing operation. You're just managing a system.
You ossify the system, and you get to a point where the system is administered, it is not run.
Well, that's right. And then so like with COVID, you realize that, okay, the whole COVID regime was a disaster. In the old way, the people responsible for it, their heads would roll, metaphorically, right? They'd all be fired. The thing would bring in new people and remake everything. But what happens in this new thing is nobody's really at fault because it's the system. So we recognize they don't acknowledge it. So something went wrong, the policies. So they say it must be the fault of the policies. So now all the same people who are responsible for drawing up the policies then go back, take all the data and ask the question of what went wrong, and then draft up a whole bunch of new policies that in theory are supposed to fix the problems of the old policies. And so there's this idea of progress built into it, that with every stage of testing and iteration, that the policies will get better and better and more efficient and more effective. And the idea is that over time, you will create the perfect plague policy that will actually work this time as you get around to it. Now, the wonderful thing about this system is
here. So
you can expand it at scale. And that's the big advantage, is that you can grow the scale of government and you can grow the scale of control that you couldn't beforehand, because you can project policy over a much wider sphere than you can quality persons. Anyways, I go on.
Well, there's a couple of layers here, right? So the first question is, if we go across all of our historical comps, we find that all of our historical comps that start out with an integralist system all decay to a managerial system, right?
Yes.
So in every historical instance where you have...
They have to, because of the exigencies of scale. Like the demands of scale will require you to switch from a person-centered integralist state to a more managerial state. And if you don't, you can't reach the level of scale that a managerial state will give you. So it's a necessity to go that way.
Well,
so anyways, go on.
But it would be a necessity if scale was an imperative. So the alternative is the alternative of like the counterfactual hypothesis is then this integralist system should be able to work at small scale. And in fact, you see this, right? You see that in small businesses, you see that in places like the Vatican, in like microstates, transitions in integralist institutions really do matter, right? Who the Pope is actually matters to how Vatican City runs. It really does.
Mostly.
It doesn't matter to the organization of the Catholic Church nearly as much, right? Because if you think about the size and scale over which that institution is projected, it has this dilutive effect, and it operates on steam, as Carlyle would say. But the city, the tiny little village that he's also in charge of, that really matters. You really can, if you're Pope Francis, put like South American pagan idols in the Vatican if you want to. That's your prerogative. So that's a whole. That's an interesting aspect to it. The fact that Canada existed at a vast scale, both geographically and in terms of number of people, is one of the reasons why this project of Grant, I think, was doomed from the start.
Yes, but it was too big to not go managerial.
The other thing that I think is important here is the iterative effect, right? So not only can you scale managerial systems really well, but during long periods of time that are not dynamic, where the organization is not doing anything particularly transformative, the organizational inertia will draw an integralist system toward becoming a managerial system, right? Because there will be no justification for handing power to an individual rather than handing power to the system.
Yeah, and in many ways, and this is the other thing that comes about in terms of the modern age with our the reaction against authority in the modern age is that dispositionally moderns, because they're afraid of hierarchical authority, actually prefer managerial systems which are actually designed in many ways to prevent excellent people from rising above the system and directing it like a thief. So the system kind of it sort of caps a ceiling. It raises the floor of quality and consistent outcomes over time, but it also then caps the ceiling as a cost. So, but it does that intentionally because you don't want great men to emerge. The system actually hates great men. It just would prefer to muddle along in this sort of maybe average to slightly above average level of control of society.
Well, but I think you're missing one of the key elements of what I put forward here. In a situation like the situation Canada got itself locked into after the defeat of the Diefenbaker populist wave, there were no prospects for a hypothetical great man to alter Canada's course. Canada's international policy was locked in as a result of their position with respect to the United States. Canada's industrial policy was locked in because of their position relative to the United States. Canada's migration policy over time became locked in because of its position with respect to the United States. And so I could go on and on down the list. Because the country didn't and could not have sovereignty in the period, it was desirable to prevent the emergence of a great man. Right? It was desirable.
That's a really, really good point, is in a sense. And this is one of those things that people have observed about Canada in terms of, say, it's signaling towards both European elites and also Blue America, is because of this iterative function of improving the policies, is Canadian administrators, without anybody really in charge, were able to set about, in some ways, perfecting progressivism institutionally, until the system the system just sort of began to eat itself over time, because all of the contradictions eventually catch up with you. But really, if there was a place where, for a brief window of maybe a decade, Canada seemed to be like the progressive haven, at least on the surface anyways. And this is because this is what the administrative system set itself the task of doing.
Yeah. And critically, like, if you look at the way that administrative systems get replaced by authoritative systems, they get replaced by authoritative systems because the character of an authoritative personality is considered necessary to enact some vision, right? Whatever that vision might be. Maybe maybe you're talking about an ancient Roman dictator being appointed to defeat an enemy. Maybe you're talking about the great COVID czar appointed to remake society to defeat this evil scourge. In any event, the transition to a politics of authority from a politics of administration requires a wide envelope of potential solutions available that you're going to then allow the authority figure to choose between, right? There are many ways you might choose to defeat the Gallic invasion of Italy. There are many ways you might choose to react as a society to some economic or social crisis. The issue is, when you're in a position like Canada has been in the latter 20th and early 21st century, the envelope of possibilities for your social policy, your social, military, and economic policies are very narrow, because you can't, like Ukraine, you're not a nation with genuine sovereignty. You can't act in disconcert to any significant degree from your benefactors. And so it's suicidal to allow the politics of authority to emerge, right? And so there's powerful incentives in that situation of limited sovereignty to prevent a personality from emerging inside the country.
Yeah, and this is a piece that I had written. You're reminding me of a piece that I had written on my Substack. There's been this whole debate recently, put the woke away, which is it's the dumb framing, but there even within this administrative system, and this is one thing that we have talked about in Canada, there are real power players, people with money and influence. And you have to understand, and this is goes back to sort of the older way, people with money and influence can, in a command and control way, get things done. Okay. And they can make changes and get things done. Now, so you have this kind of what you would call the oligarchs. So there's the Canadian, the Laurentians are, in a sense, an oligarchy behind the scenes. So what we're talking about today, and in this quote unquote pivot thing, is there appears to be a sense that certain key players in this Laurentian oligarchy have woken up and have said, this can't go on. We need to make a change. Now, the problem is that an administrative bureaucracy, one of the things that makes it function is like you have the policy network,
that it never actually changes, right?
Well, but the thing is also too, is that you're able to trust that everybody in the system is doing their bit, because they're all, in a sense, ideologically committed to the policy regime that's there. So the problem that the Laurentians will have right now is that they have to mimetically, because they don't have great man, because the system is resistant to great man. And like you say, the geopolitical situation is resistant to a great man arising in Canada. So you have to then, behind the scenes, using their particular, carrot and stick and manipulating things, they have to create a mimetic context where across this administrative system, a new regime, because you're now seeing a conflict between sort of an old and new. So you have elites behind the scenes are signaling we need to change. You have a whole surface level, you have media, you have all these other institutions that have now an existing policy and procedure framework that is very progressive. And so they have to find a way to project mimetically to say that your success and advancement is no longer going to be based on progressive policies, but on protecting the interests of the Laurentian elite, which we believe are the interests of Canada, which means you have to start discriminating against Indians and Chinese. This is a big change, right? And so this is the question is, can they pull it off?
The issue here is that the way that you do that is by manipulating the propaganda apparatus, right?
Which they have complete control over.
And this is why in the world that existed 10 or 15 years ago, it would be very difficult for the Laurentian elite to pull off this
it's more difficult
pivot.
Than it is now.
More difficult than it is now. They have more control of the propaganda apparatus than they did at the time. On the other hand, because of the incentive structure that was created for the academic system, which was part of their propaganda apparatus, they have a new set of problems for manipulating the high status element of the propaganda apparatus, which exists inside the university system. And it's not entirely clear whether they'll be able to pull that off, but I think I think what you will see is that the next set of important political confrontations that go on within Canada will actually go on in the management of academia.
You may be right there. And then who's getting advantage? And that's one of the things, though, too, is that, if you really wanted to do the work, you could track the networks of people of who's related to who and who went to school with whom and so forth. But you're going to start seeing that the right people suddenly, who maybe wouldn't have gotten a position on, the board of governors at Western or U of T, suddenly now get in the right position on the board. And then you're establishing certain chairs, and all of a sudden is like, when did that old white guy get, with cranky opinions, how did he manage to get a chair? And you're like, and then when you begin to put the pieces together, it begins to make sense that, they're using the mechanisms that they've had, and if you can't find a chair originally, you just endow a chair or two. and next thing you know, you've got a couple of friendly professors, right? And this is how it kind
Canada,
of works.
they have the advantage that the Research Council has such complete control over who gets professorships and who doesn't, right?
Yes.
So they have a lot more power like if you compare it to the U.S. university system, where a lot of U.S. universities actually have their own sources of money and their own endowments, in Canada, outside of U of T and maybe McGill, the entire rest of the system is dependent on federal subsidies for students and on a system of federal grants for research. And the only tool that they have, and number 3, the number of student visas that the federal government is going to issue. So the federal government has really, really powerful tools at its disposal if it's willing to use them. And I think this is probably the next confrontation that you're going to see. You're going to see the Carney government explain to the universities that they have to tell us all and tell all of their students why it's so important that we should eliminate the CCP as a competitor to their power in Canada.
Yeah, I was just kind of thinking jokingly in the back of my mind, that the Liberal Party should use us as consultants because we have a really good idea of how to do this. But the once you begin to understand the theory of it and how it works, I mean, to be honest, like the American progressives could only dream of the kind of institutional control that the Laurentians have in Canada. And so people wonder, well, are they going to be able to make the pivot? Is it real? So a lot of it is very, very early right now. And you have, you have competing old ways, new ways. It's emergent. And even Carney was just on a trip at the end of March talking about, global business ties and so forth. So, I mean, we're not going to become an autarky, but some of this language, even they are figuring it out for themselves right now. But you can see it in the Liberal Party advertising. Look at there's no brown people in the advertising, and he's talking about Canadian values, Canadian heritage. These things are very, very significant. It's just kind of learning how to read the tea leaves of what you're seeing with your eyes. And that's kind of the thing that we're trying to be here to do, is teach people how to read the propaganda so you can understand what they're actually telling you in the images and the messages that you're seeing.
Yeah. And all that is not to say that the kind of Canada that you or I might want is going to materialize as a result of the great stewardship of the Laurentian elite. These people all still have, well, let's put it this way. I don't think I'm getting my Liberal Party consulting job anytime soon. But
I was kind of laughing in the back of my mind. I thought you'll know that they've gone both feet in the deep end for the pivot when they start talking about Canada's Christian heritage. That's when you'll know. Yeah.
That's when you know it's all over.
When Mark Carney goes to church again, that's when it's when
they stop dunking on Stephen Harper for being an evil evangelical.
Oh my word. Yeah. Mark Carney and Stephen Harper together at church worshiping together.
Oh my goodness, what a strange world that would be. But
and this is the thing, is you're not saying that's never going to happen. It's if they need to, they'll do it.
To go there, they'll go there.
Oh yeah.
That's and the worst part is, that a huge fraction of the people that we know will be eating it up, right?
Yeah, we I just hit my mic, so in case that's what you're and this is why we have this sort of a measure of caution, that Canadian electoral politics is what it is. You'll go out and you'll vote and you put a thing in the ballot box. But a lot of what actually happens in Canada happens completely independent of that whole voting process, and the whole electoral political process. And that's, I think, one of the big things that people have to pay attention to, that much of what is going on now is structural. And so Canadian politics is really going to be happening behind the scenes. It's very much possible that Carney will be able to do what the Golden Boy was never able to do, which is win a majority government. It's just mind-boggling to think that it's within reach.
Well, this is what I say frequently on outside podcast appearances. Canada has real politics, but fake electoral politics.
Oh yeah.
And as we discuss all of this, I think that's important to bear in mind. I think we've kind of beaten up on Grant's vision sufficiently. I also think it's worth noting that expecting the perpetual patriotism of the civil service to override the inevitable economic opportunities that these people would be offered out by industry connected to the rest of the world. I mean, Grant himself talks about the fact that the class that he was looking for to exist to make Canada into the kind of independent nation that he dreamed that it could be simply didn't exist. And I think it didn't exist because the incentive structure to produce that class did not and could not exist within Canada and will not exist in the foreseeable future.
No, and here's the thing that people have to understand, that if the kind of leaders that we're looking for come, I mean, I suppose in theory it could come out through the Conservative Party of Canada and the Albertan elites, although I'm not holding my breath there. But being an in toto system, that in many ways, if it's going to happen in Canada, where Canada makes the kinds of transitions that it would need to, it's not because of our size, say relative to the United States or the European Union, we're never going to have complete full sovereignty. But if Canada is going to gain a measure of sovereignty that it doesn't have now, the political changes that need to happen are going to happen from within the Laurentian Elite. So if somebody comes in, quote unquote, from the outside, they're going to have to do it by going through the usual mechanisms. You know, you're going to, if you can't get to one of the great boarding schools, you're going to have to go to, U of T law or Western law. And, you go in, or you're at Ivy Business School or Robarts Business School, and then you make the right connections with the right people who do have the right connections. And then you set up your political career, and you're playing a long game of 30 years. And you're building a network, and you're doing it all from within, but also from within the Liberal Party of Canada.
I mean, the alternative is that the dynamics which empower the Laurentian elite fundamentally change, right? So the Laurentian elite got into their position of power because the withdrawal of the British Empire collapsed their competing elite classes' potential interests. The Western elite's challenge to power existed because of the trade relationship with the United States. Right. So they were enriched as a class because of the opportunity to leverage the export relationship. When the fundamental dynamics that drive the distribution of wealth and power in the country change, the Laurentian elite may find themselves on the wrong side of that change. And so as we look at Canadian politics and the dynamics between its elite groups, the things that we're actually looking for are things that alter the dynamic, the landscape that delivers wealth and power to the various groups within the country. That's why the tariffs from the United States were such a political disaster for Canada, because if they go ahead, and even if they're just threatened, they permanently move power from the Western elite into the hands of the Laurentian elite. And on this podcast, we hate the Laurentian elite.
We do, and generally in part because of their hatred of Christians.
Well, they hate us, faith. So,
Yeah. And this is also like the other piece, and this goes back to why we're even talking about the pivot, is the rise of the Chinese community and the Khalistani Sikh Indian community, as now independent, self-sustaining rival power bases in Canada that need to be checked. So again, like you say, what are you looking for the circumstances on the ground? Well, those definitely change the circumstances of the ground and alter the power networks in Canada that the Laurentian elite had to stand up and take notice or potentially lose their grip on the country.
Well, and especially given the geopolitical competition between the United States and China, it is absolutely essential for the Laurentian elite to properly manage their relationship with that community.
The South Seas, China, India. Yeah, and I think, well, here's the thing too, and this is, our friend has, Jimmy Thomas has noted this as well too, is that they're, doing business with India and China, as opposed to doing with the US, would require a kind of infrastructure investment that is mind-boggling if it could even be achieved. Well, so your natural, easy trading partner, your low cost, and these are real things in terms of administrative costs. So your real sunk costs in doing business are always lowest with the United States. So that's your natural partner in doing business. And so you then have to figure out a way to curb your ties to India and China because they're upsetting your ties with the United States. And that's a kind of a hard political reality of the moment right now.
Yeah, and it would be an easier political reality to reckon with if you had a partner in the United States that was more firmly in control of sovereignty and more consistent in their behavior. Instead, what you have is a U.S. government that is behaving erratically as a consequence of a struggle going on inside the U.S. government.
The culture war.
Yeah, there's there's
Blue America and Red America are battling for the future of the United States, and that's making it hard for everybody else outside the U.S. to do business.
But the issue is more layered than that, because there's what you see on the surface in Blue America versus Red America. The elite classes represented by that political conflict are less distinct than you might think.
Yeah,
but there are real conflicts within the American elite going on, and certainly the American government is behaving highly erratically as a consequence of these internal struggles.
Yeah, these competing elite groups within the U.S.
So yeah, it's a difficult thing to manage as an outsider, but it just kind of is what it is at the moment. Anyways, we're coming up on time. This will be the end of looking at Grant Lament for a Nation. We'll be looking for some feedback here, but we will probably do this again where we look at a Canadian author, maybe a political philosopher or historian, and look at a particular moment in the country's history that we think is particularly germane. But let us know in the comments if you enjoyed this element of the format, or you'd like to come back more to current events, and if you have a particular author or historian or figure that you'd like to look at. Thank you so much for your time, Cryptos. Thank you for joining me. Thank you to all of the audience members, and I hope you learned something. I hope you have a great day and a great week, and we will be back here with our next randomly timed podcast. Thank you so much.
Canada originally was put together by two groups of people who didn't have much in common but didn't want to be American.
The line just popped into my head. A bunch of the boys was a-whooping it up. And there I got my start.
We have had a flag. Flags can be changed. But flags cannot be imposed, the sacred symbols of a people's hopes and aspirations, by the simple, capricious, personal choice of a Prime Minister of Canada.
I have watched this country for half of my life from abroad, and we have turned complacency into just that, a national sport.
I am resolutely opposed to all innovation, all change, but I am determined to understand what's happening. I don't choose just to sit and let the juggernaut roll over me.